On September 23rd, 1996, Taliban movement took control over the Afghan capital, Kabul, and became de facto rulers of Afghanistan. Taliban Supreme Ruler Mohammed Mullah Omar appointed a number of acting ministers to run the administration in Kabul, while the seat of power remained in Mullah Omar's home province of Kandahar. The new regime faced enormous challenges, the most urgent being the military threat from northern Afghan commanders and warlords who had refused to give up their territory to the Taliban. The war against these commanders would continue throughout the Taliban's reign, but was most intense in 1997 and 1998, when the Taliban struggled to capture the northern Afghan city of Mazar-e-Sharif. It is unclear whether bin Laden had an opinion of the Taliban at the time. The student movement was certainly known to the Arab world. Its military advances in southern and eastern Afghanistan between 1995 and 1996 was being covered in the Arab press. Moreover, Taliban were well known among Afghan Arabs in Peshawar. In 1995, Al Jihad magazine carried an interview with the leader of the Pakistani group, the Harakat al-Ansar, who praised the Taliban movement's advances. In 1996, the Deobandi scholar Abdul Qayyum Haqqani, a known Taliban supporter, visited bin Laden in Jalalabad. Although there are no indications that bin Laden had direct ties to Taliban forces before 1996, bin Laden had at least ties to individuals who were ideologically supportive of the Taliban itself. This suggests that bin Laden may have been favorably inclined to accept the Taliban's ideology. But there are scarce indications that bin Laden sought to establish relations to the Taliban before circumstances forced him to do so. On their way toward Jalalabad, the Taliban had already encountered Arabs. The first encounter probably happened in Khost in 1995, where Arabs had been running training camps throughout the Civil War. We know little of the details of these encounters, but it was most likely an undramatic affair. Al-Qaeda's Jihad Wall Camp in southern Khost was under the protection of the Khost government, which was controlled by Jalaluddin Haqqani's clan. When the Taliban came to Khost in 1995, Haqqani decided to ally himself with the Taliban instead of putting up resistance. This probably meant that the Khost government continued to run business as usual in the province, including hosting the Jihad Wall Camp. The only foreign training camp affected by the Taliban's takeover appears to have been the camp of Hizb-ul-Mujahideen, a Pakistani camp affiliated with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jamaat-e-Islami, which was shut down by the Taliban and handed over to another Pakistani group, the Harakat al-Ansar, in November of 1996. Eyewitness accounts from this period confirmed that the Taliban's takeover of Khost was a rather undramatic event for the Arabs. The first account is provided by Omar Nashiri, French-Algerian jihadist who was a trainee in Khaldian at the time. He says that after the Taliban's takeover of Khost, a group of turbaned men came to visit the camp. They were not high-ranking Taliban members, but local representatives who came to the camp to ask for weapons. After having tea with the camp's leadership, they left in peace, apparently convinced that the Khaldian camp was no military threat to them. The other account is given by Mustafa Hamid, who stayed in the Jihad Wall area at the time. He does not mention any Taliban coming to the camp, but he says that he sent a delegation to Gardez to offer the Taliban support in the form of training. They did not even know how to shoot or clean their weapons, he recalled, rather condescendingly. But again, their encounter was peaceful, and it was with local Taliban and not with high-ranking leaders. In other cases, the Taliban encountered Arabs who fought them violently. These were Arabs who fought with Hekmatyar during the Afghan Civil War and who defended his stronghold at Chahar Asub, south of Kabul. In mid-1998, Abu Musab al-Siri described the battle between Taliban and Hekmatyar's Arabs between 1994 and 1996 as having an overall negative effect on the relations between the Arabs and the Taliban. He claimed that the Taliban only saw symbolic good in the Arabs, and in reality, the first Arab behavior they observed was their fighting with Hekmatyar. Even if it was a small group, they were still Arabs. But these fighters were not associated with bin Laden. Mustafa Hamid argued that the relationship between the Arabs and the Taliban took a decisive turn when bin Laden entered into an alliance with Mullah Omar after 1996. This is supported by an al-Hayat account, which suggests that the reason why the Taliban allowed bin Laden and his followers to stay in Afghanistan was that he had not fought against the movement in the past. Most accounts agree that after the Taliban's takeover of Jalalabad in September of 1996, There was a meeting between Taliban representatives and bin Laden to determine the latter's future in Afghanistan. Many of the accounts emphasized that the Taliban's humble attitude toward the Saudi guest and their immediate readiness to serve him. Abu Musab al-Suri recalled that when the Taliban arrived in Nangarhar, they sent a delegation to meet with bin Laden in Jalalabad. They assured him that he would be treated as an honorary guest of the country, and even told him courteously, "We will not be your servants. We will serve the dust on which you walk." Omar bin Laden's account is similar. He wrote that a Taliban delegation visited bin Laden in Tora Bora shortly after Mullah Nurullah's death and ensured that bin Laden would be under the protection of the Taliban. Internal al-Qaeda sources from the time confirmed the impression that the first meeting was cordial. In a letter written probably around mid-1997, Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Muhammad Atef, recounted, "After the Taliban arrived in Jalalabad, we met with them, and they gave us a warm welcome." Taliban officials have later insisted that we did not invite Osama, we gave him a legacy. As discussed, ex-Mujahideen in eastern Afghanistan, not the Taliban, were responsible for bin Laden's return to Afghanistan. However, once Taliban conquered Nangarhar, there is every reason to believe they gave him a courteous welcome. Taliban officials in Nangarhar who spoke with the Pakistani journalist Rami Mullah Yousafzai in October of 1996 gave 3 reasons for hosting bin Laden. First, he was already in their territory when they took Jalalabad. Second, bin Laden had assisted the Afghans a lot in their jihad against the Soviets. Third, Taliban were not sure he was involved in terrorist activities and had not yet seen convincing proof of his involvement. The Arab journalist Ahmad Zaidan wrote around the same time that bin Laden sent an envoy to Mullah Omar in Kandahar, declaring his peaceful intentions. Quote, "The envoy who visited the Taliban leadership's headquarters in Kandahar told them that Osama bin Laden would support the movement. The Taliban told the envoy that they welcomed bin Laden and the Afghan Arabs that accompany him to stay in the areas under their control, especially since they had not participated in the fight against the movement." End quote. Although the gist of the preceding account seem well documented, there is probably also information missing. Bin Laden was likely dependent on intermediaries to introduce him to the Taliban. Existing literature claims that the Pakistan ISI played a role in introducing bin Laden to Taliban officials. These claims are somewhat problematic because they are not well substantiated, probably based on the common perception at the time that Taliban were controlled by the ISI. Other sources suggest that Jalaluddin Haqqani introduced bin Laden to the Taliban, which may seem more plausible since there was a historical tie between the two, and since Haqqani had already aligned himself with the Taliban by the time bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan. However, there are contradictions by other sources, including the well-informed Arab journalist Ahmed Zaidan, who wrote in 1996 that it was Engineer Mahmoud who acted as the intermediary between bin Laden and the Taliban prior to Engineer Mahmoud's death. By March 1997, bin Laden had secured Mullah Omar's personal permission to stay in Afghanistan. On March 6, 1997, media reported that bin Laden had met with Mullah Omar in Afghanistan, and that this meeting took place with Taliban leadership, and had offered the Taliban leader assistance in 2 areas he knew well from before: construction and fighting. Bin Laden had agreed to carry out a few construction projects, such as improving the road between Jalalabad and Kandahar, to build a water channel to the agricultural fields in Kandahar. Moreover, he offered to put his fighters to the service of the Taliban and to assist them in their fight against Mujahideen factions in northern Afghanistan. This account is substantiated by Abu Musab al-Suri, who recalled that in the beginning of the relationship between the Taliban and bin Laden, that bin Laden made many promises to Mullah Omar, such as urbanization projects, road building, economic projects, and the provision of fighters to defend Kabul, but that the wind blew them away, as he wrote. It is unclear if bin Laden ever carried out the promised reconstruction projects, but whatever he may have promised, it was probably taken as credible. Bin Laden was known as a wealthy Saudi and a generous financier of the Afghan Mujahideen movement. He had reportedly been involved in road construction projects in eastern Afghanistan, having recently helped improve the road between Jalalabad and Torkham at the Afghan-Pakistani border. Indeed, many sources had emphasized that money was a central component of the initial alliance between bin Laden and the Taliban. Former Taliban officials have claimed that bin Laden had a deliberate strategy of buying his way into the Taliban's hearts. According to former Taliban ministry official Vahed Mojdeh, quote, Osama and his loyalists were, of course, well aware of how to influence the Taliban, relying on their previous experiences with Mujahideen leaders. The purchase of expensive automobiles for Mullah Omar and his loyalists was the first step in that direction. Financial support in the war against the Taliban's opposition, in particular buying off the opposing commanders, proved to be an effective strategy. Using his own financial assets, Osama bin Laden successfully positioned himself among the Taliban, end quote. But the size of bin Laden's financial assets in 1996 is disputed. In the words of the author Steve Cole, bin Laden was close to financial bankruptcy when he arrived in Afghanistan in 1996 because the Sudanese government had confiscated much of his personal assets. All that remained was a modest amount of personal savings, in addition to donations from charities and wealthy individuals in the Gulf. Omar bin Laden testified to the fact that his father was no longer a rich man in 1996. Their family had been poor since 1994, he claimed, when bin Laden's personal assets were frozen. But the situation did not become critical until 1998, when the Saudi regime banned charities from donating money to bin Laden's cause. Omar recalled that for a period in 1998, bin Laden barely had enough money to feed his family and fighters in Kandahar. Quote, we were truly desperate for the first time. In such a low state, there was no money for food for our family, or for the enormous band of people who had gathered around my father, end quote. In the end, bin Laden's financial contributions to the Taliban were probably more symbolic than strategically important. Although bin Laden might have had access to a network of wealthy donors abroad, it is unlikely that his financial and monetary contributions to the Taliban regime ever exceeded those of the Taliban's major state sponsors, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Ahmed Rashid argues that Saudi and Pakistani intelligence gave a far more substantial contribution to the Taliban's car park and finances. Quote, Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki Al Faisal visited Kandahar in mid-June of 1998, after which the Saudis provided the Taliban with 400 pickup trucks and financial aid. Pakistan ISI had prepared a budget of some 2 billion rupees, equal amount of $5 million US, for logistical support that was needed by the Taliban, end quote. Due to the close ties between bin Laden and the Saudi intelligence during the mid-1980s, it is possible that some of bin Laden's gifts to Mullah Omar may have been conflated with those of the Saudi intelligence. Another possibility is that the land cruisers attributed to bin Laden were in fact gifts left by rich Gulf Arabs who regularly came to southern Afghanistan for falcon hunting and other recreation. There are many possible reasons that the Taliban decided to host bin Laden. The initial decision is often ascribed to a mixture of Afghan cultural codes, Taliban's and bin Laden's common identity as Muslims, bin Laden's status as a former benefactor of the Afghan Mujahideen movement, and his promises to provide the Taliban with financial and military assistance. Pashtun culture, known as Pashtunwali, which obligates a host to honor and protect his guests, has been described as a reason in itself, and may certainly have colored the initial meeting between the Taliban representatives and bin Laden. Intermediaries such as Eastern Afghan commanders or Deobandi scholars who supported bin Laden may also play the role in forging their ties. Overall, the historical context must be taken into account. In August-September of 1996, the Taliban was in the middle of a military campaign to take control over Kabul, which they achieved on September 26, 1996. After that, they were preoccupied with their goal of conquering northern Afghanistan. Bin Laden's men were not involved in the civil war, and therefore posed no immediate threat to the Taliban's conquest for power within Afghanistan. There was simply no compelling reasons for the Taliban to expel him, at least not at the time. But this was soon about to change.